Larchmont is located along the Long Island South in Westchester County in New York. It's a charming and affluent village that feels worlds away from the chaos of nearby New York City. It was originally a summer retreat for Manhattan's elite, but it blossomed in the late 19th century when the railroad brought city dwellers to its shores. Over the decades, it's developed into a tight-knit community known for its tree-lined streets, historic homes, and genteel atmosphere. The Larchmont Police Department reflects this quiet character. It's housed in a modest brick building just off Main Street, and is more Mayberry than Manhattan. Officers often know the residents by face, if not by name. Shifts were steady, predictable, almost boring in the best possible way. It's the kind of place where the radio crackles with reports of a raccoon in someone's attic or a suspicious parked car, rarely anything more sinister. But even the most peaceful of places have their shadows. Before 1989, the village had only ever recorded 2 murders in its entire history. The first occurred in October 1938 when a whimpering dog led its owner to the body of 17-year-old Mart Imelda Coyle. She had been beaten to death and dumped in a vacant lot off Palmer Avenue. The case was never solved. Nearly 4 decades later, tragedy struck once more. In 1976, patrolman Arthur DeMatt responded to reports of a homeless man near the train tracks. During the encounter, 23-year-old Anthony Curtis Blanks wrestled DeMatt's gun from him and fatally shot the officer. His badge still hangs in the village hall, a solemn tribute to a rare but devastating loss. Since then, the police department had returned to its sleepy rhythm. That was until New Year's Day of 1989. As the first evening of the new year settled over Larchmont, festive lights still blinked in windows and the lingering scent of pine clung to the cold air. Families returned home from holiday dinners. Children played in snowy front yards, their laughter muffled by scarves. Inside the police station, the mood was quiet, almost drowsy. A couple of officers nursed coffees, reviewing routine paperwork, while the dispatcher occasionally glanced at the silent switchboard. At 7:30 p.m, the front door opened with a jingle of bells. A man stepped inside, brushing the chill from his coat. He looked uneasy as he approached the front desk. He said that he hadn't seen or heard from his sister and her husband all weekend. In a town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen, something had. Lincoln Street wasn't the kind of place you just stumbled upon. You arrived there on purpose. It curled through the heart of Larchmont like a secret. A residential street so pristine, so well kept, it felt almost staged. It was the kind of place where children still played hopscotch on the sidewalks, and neighbours exchanged nods while raking their leaves. It was wide enough for 2 cars to pass without slowing, and in the summertime the trees lining both sides formed a canopy so dense the street glowed green. And about halfway up that quiet stretch of Lincoln Street sat house number 36. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. The 2-story home, with its early 20th century bones and graceful stone steps, had presence. The kind of presence that made people pause mid-walk and look just a second longer. It was regal, but it wasn't showy. Like it belonged there, rooted and unwavering. In 1989, this house belonged to Dr. Lakshmanrao and Dr. Shanta Chervu, and their story was the embodiment of everything America promised to those brave enough to chase the dream. Originally from New Delhi, they had come to the United States in the early 1960s, chasing a dream with little more than education and determination in their suitcases. By all accounts, they'd caught that dream. Lakshmanrao was a professor of nuclear medicine at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Shanta worked in emergency medicine at New Rochelle Hospital. She had trained in geriatrics at Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, and even on her rare days off, she never truly slowed. Their lives were demanding, but the Chervus never wore stress the way that others did. They had 2 children, both grown, both thriving. A run was out west, deep into a surgical residency at UCLA. Arati, a gifted economist, was carving out her own path in Toronto. From the outside, the Chervus were the perfect picture. Not just of success, but of something richer. Each evening after grueling shifts in the emergency room, Shanta would return to her kitchen. The scent of cumin and turmeric would drift through the house as she prepared traditional Indian meals, chopping vegetables with worn familiar knives at the counter, just as she had in her mother's kitchen in India decades before. For years, she didn't even own a proper knife block. Then their daughter, Arati, got her first real paycheck and brought her mother a gift, an elegant set of German Henkel's knives in a beautiful wooden block. It was a thank you for everything her parents had sacrificed. Shanta wore her Mangal Sutra every day, a chain of black beads that never left her neck, even beneath her hospital scrubs. And Lakshmanrao, he was the kind of man who collected degrees the way other people collected books or bottle caps. Between the two of them, the Chervus spoke 6 languages. Their home was more than shelter, it was sanctuary. They opened their doors to others as well. Over the years, they helped more than a dozen relatives immigrate from India. Brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews. They gave generously, quietly, without ever asking for recognition. One of those nephews, Raghu Bamadeen, once put it best. They immigrated here. They worked hard. They built themselves a home and achieved prominent positions as doctors. And then they brought 10 brothers and sisters here. It was a beautiful story. The kind of story people want to believe always ends well. The kind of story that makes you believe in the promise of America, in the promise of hard work and determination. But even the most perfect stories have their shadows. And Larchmont's shadows were deeper and more twisted than anybody could have imagined. It was December 31st, 1988, and New Rochelle Hospital's emergency department was chaos. It was one of those holiday nights where patients just kept coming, where the coffee grew colder and the charts piled higher and higher. Dr. Shanta Chervu should have gone home hours ago, but that wasn't who she was. She stayed until every chart was signed, every patient properly discharged. That was Shanta, meticulous, caring, never leaving work half done. Just after midnight, as 1989 officially began, she made her rounds. Not medical rounds, but personal ones. She walked through the hospital corridors wishing everybody a happy new year. Then she waited, but not outside. Shanta never waited outside. She didn't feel safe there. She waited in the hallway, inside the building, until she saw familiar headlights pull up. Lakshmanrao, as always, was there to pick her up. They drove home through the quiet streets of Westchester County, past houses where families were sleeping off their New Year celebrations. They had no idea they were driving towards their final night at 36 Lincoln Street. About 24 hours later, that same Queen's Hospital was filled with celebration. More than 20 members of the Chervu family had gathered to welcome a new life into the world, the birth of a first-generation American. It was supposed to be a milestone, a joyful chapter in the family's story. And yet, something felt incomplete. Lakshmanrao and Shanta, the very people who had made this life possible for so many, were missing. They had sponsored every single relative in that waiting room. Every sibling, every cousin, every niece and nephew. Without them, the celebration simply didn't feel whole. But when call after call went unanswered, celebration gave way to concern. By sunrise, that concern had blossomed into dread. Shanta's brother volunteered to check in, just to be safe. He drove the familiar route to Larchmont, winding past quiet houses and holiday wreaths, past empty sidewalks and leafless streets. The house at 36 Lincoln Street stood still, as if it was asleep. He knocked on the front door and waited. Nobody came to answer it. He peered through the windows but only saw the empty shapes of furniture in the morning shadow. Then he walked around back. As he drew closer, he saw that the back door was open. Its glass pane had been shattered. Too afraid to go further, he backed away and drove straight to the Larchmont Police Department. Police officers arrived swiftly. Among them was Sergeant Kenneth Cann. They circled to the back of the house and immediately saw the glass scattered on the cold cement. Cann nudged the rear door open. It creaked against the stillness. He identified himself and called out to the Chervus. There was only silence. They moved inside, then they climbed the stairs. Before they even reached the bedroom, the smell hit them. It wasn't the smell of blood, but the unmistakable scent of decomposition. The master bedroom door opened. The bed was soaked, dark, heavy, and glistening with blood. In the middle lay Lakshmanrao and Shanta, still in their pyjamas, still side by side, but now eerily silent. It was clear even from the doorway that they were both gone. Rigor mortis had set in. There was blood spattered on the walls and on the ceiling. The Chervus never stood a chance. Shanta had suffered 8 stab wounds. One pierced her heart, another cut through to her spine, and even after death, the killer had slashed her throat. Lakshmanrao had been stabbed 14 times. In the face, the hand, the chest, the abdomen. Like his wife, his throat had also been slashed. The bodies were removed and taken to the medical examiner's office, but the horror of that scene clung to the house like a fog. It didn't take long for word to spread. A double homicide in Larchmont, a quiet, picturesque suburb where violence simply didn't happen. Within hours of discovering the bodies of Dr. Lakshmanrao and Dr. Shanta Chervu, Lincoln Street transformed. The quiet storybook neighbourhood was suddenly a crime scene. Police tape fluttered from the porch railings. Markers dotted the lawns. Investigators moved in and out of the home with hushed urgency. Cameras flashing, gloved hands gathering evidence, whispered exchanged beneath furrowed brows. It was the first homicide in Larchmont in more than a decade, and detectives felt the weight of that immediately. They knew the eyes of the community were now on them. The initial theory was a familiar one, a robbery gone wrong. But that theory crumbled almost as quickly as it was formed. The inside of the home didn't reflect chaos. Nothing appeared ransacked. Valuable items, including jewellery, electronics and cash, remained untouched, sitting in plain sight like bait the killer never took. It didn't make sense. If somebody had broken in to steal, they had failed miserably, and instead carried out an execution. So detectives turned their focus elsewhere. They combed the neighbourhood with a precision that bordered on desperate. Garbage cans were overturned, storm drains were searched with flashlights and mirrors, metal detectors swept beneath hedges and down driveways. They were looking for something very specific. A knife. One was missing from the elegant Henkel block in the Chervu kitchen, the butcher knife. It was likely the murder weapon. But after days of searching, nothing turned up. Detective Captain Michael Garcia addressed the press and said, "We looked everywhere for a weapon. We haven't come up with anything yet." And so the focus shifted, away from physical evidence and towards the lives of the victims. They figured out the last time either of them were seen was when Shanta had finished her shift and waited outside for her husband to collect her. One of her colleagues, Anne Kenny, remembered it clearly. To be afraid to wait outside the emergency room and then be killed in your own house, it's so ironic. She was a very timid, gentle soul. As always, Lakshmanrao was the one to pick her up. They drove home, and 2 days later, their bodies were found, soaked in blood, in the sanctuary they'd spent a lifetime building. Now detectives were faced with a disturbing question. If it wasn't a burglary, if it wasn't random, then who wanted them dead? They began looking into their past, their social circles, their hospital colleagues. They searched for any hint of tension. A jealous co-worker, a spurned friend, a disgruntled patient. But they found none. Everyone spoke of the Chervus the same way, with admiration, with warmth, and now with grief. There were no enemies, no scandals, just a quiet, perfect couple who seemed to have done everything right. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. By spring, the flowers had returned to Lincoln Street. The blood had been washed away, but something lingered. Not just grief, not just confusion, but silence. The kind of silence that fills a room after something terrible happens and nobody knows what to say. Detectives, meanwhile, were stuck in place. Despite their efforts, including the interviews, the search parties, the forensic sweeps, they were no closer to finding an answer than they were on day one. They didn't believe that anybody in the Chervu family was involved. Everybody had alibis. Everyone had been accounted for. Still, the leads were scarce. So Police Chief William Kersey announced a $25,000 reward, hoping it might jar something loose. But the phone lines stayed quiet. Nobody came forward. In Larchmont, life continued. Children walked to school, mail was delivered, lawns were mown. But something had changed. People were trying to resume with their routines, but they were doing so with a killer still among them. And so the town invented its own kind of comfort. The story people told themselves over coffee and across garden fences was simple. This wasn't random. The Chervus had been targeted. Their neighbour, Joan Sasson, said it plainly. We live in a very safe neighbourhood. Most people feel this was targeted at one specific family. It was an isolated event. People needed for that to be true. Because if it wasn't, if it was random, then nobody was safe. And yet, even with a double murder on their doorstep, most residents didn't change much. They still answered the door for strangers, still left keys in unlocked sheds, still chatted casually with passer-by. Ralph Engel echoed the sentiment and said, "We may be totally wrong, but the general belief seems to be that this wasn't random. Not some crazy murderer. There really has been no request for concerted community action." But behind that fragile calm, the rumours were relentless. Some believed that the killer had ties to the Indian community, that it was personal, that they had already fled the country and would never be seen again. That theory, albeit dark, gave people comfort, because it meant that they were safe. It meant this horror story had already ended. But others didn't buy it, especially not the Indian American community. In fact, many of them believed that police weren't doing enough. They worried the case was being ignored, swept aside, because the victims weren't white. Some even feared that the murders might have been racially motivated. That possibility wasn't without precedent. Just a few months earlier, in New Jersey, several attacks had been carried out by self-identified vigilantes calling themselves the Dot Busters, a cruel reference to the bindi worn by Hindu women. Detectives denied any link. They insisted the murders weren't hate crimes, but they offered very little else. No motive, no suspect, no timeline, and no updates. Frustration mounted, faith in the system eroded. And as the silence dragged on, people began to wonder if justice would ever come. Eventually, the months slipped into years. The house at 36 Lincoln Street was sold. The neighbourhood slowly stopped talking about what had happened. The Chervus, it seemed, had been buried, not just in the earth, but in memory. By 1993, 4 years after the murders, Police Chief Kersey gave an interview and said, "I wish I could tell you there was something new. It's a frustrating case." But what the police chief didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that everything was about to change. An arrest was coming, and when it arrived, it stunned everyone. On the 20th of May, 1993, more than 4 years after Lakshmanrao and Shanta Chervu were brutally murdered, detectives called a press conference. There had been a development. A 25-year-old man named Paul Cox had been arrested. He was a self-employed carpenter working under the name PC Construction. He lived in New Rochelle, just a short drive from Larchmont. He held a job as a live-in superintendent at an apartment complex. Cleaned gutters, replaced locks, fixed the boilers. To most people, he was just a handyman, and a quiet one at that. But to those who knew the name Cox, the arrest came as a shock. Because Paul Cox didn't come from obscurity. He came from legacy. His grandfather, Joseph van der Noot, was one of the most well-known local politicians in Westchester County. He'd served as the Mamaroneck town supervisor. Before that, he was on the town council. Paul's mother, Mary van der Noot Cox, was a junior league member. His father, Francis Cox III, was a prominent attorney. This wasn't the kind of family that people whispered about. This was the kind of family you sent Christmas cards to. But the connection that shook the community the most was the house. Paul Cox had grown up inside 36 Lincoln Street, the very home where Lakshmanrao and Shanta were killed. He had lived there until he was 7 years old. His parents had sold the house to the Chervus in 1970. The murders had happened almost 2 decades later. The overlap of place, of memory, of violence was almost too disturbing to process. To the residents of Lincoln Street, this wasn't just an arrest. It was a collapse of the narrative that they had constructed. Somebody from the Indian community hadn't committed this crime. It wasn't a cultural dispute or some far-off mystery. It was Paul, the quiet kid from the neighbourhood, the one whose roots ran so deep into the foundations of Larchmont that people still called his family by name. Antia Judas, a neighbour, told reporters, "The police made it clear it wasn't a random incident. Most people thought it was somebody within the Indian community." They weren't alone. Even Paul's tenants were stunned. Steve McNally, a fellow resident, said, "The place was a rat hole and he took care of cleaning it up. He did seem like a nice guy. He never gave any trouble." But now the same man who had been fixing leaking pipes and patching drywall was in handcuffs and charged with a double murder. Tom Constable, a local lawyer, tried to hold on to that old Larchmont logic and said, "It's a very sad thing, but an arrest isn't a conviction." And he was right, but what nobody could yet imagine was the dark undercurrent beneath Paul Cox's quiet demeanour. Because the real story, the why, was more terrifying than anybody had expected. The truth was coming, and it was buried not in a motive, but in memory. It was about 3 a.m. on the 31st of December 1988 when Paul Cox lost control of his 1979 Chevrolet and crashed it on a sharp turn along 5th Avenue in New Rochelle. A few hours later, police found the car abandoned. They called the hospital in Paul Cox's home, but there was no sign of him. At the time, Cox was an alcoholic, but in 1990 something shifted. He was in Alcoholics Anonymous trying to turn his life around. During one of the meetings, Cox stood up to take the 4th and 5th steps of the 12-step program, the ones that ask members to take a moral inventory and admit their wrongdoings to themselves, to God, and to another person. But what Cox shared would leave the room silent. He said he believed he had killed 2 people while blackout drunk. He didn't know it, not for sure, but he felt it. He told the group he had been out drinking heavily the night of the car crash, out at a bar on North Avenue. But after the wreck, instead of heading home, he ended up on Lincoln Street, outside his childhood home, the Chervu's home. He said he had a dream where he smashed a window, then walked inside. He said he grabbed a knife from the kitchen like it was instinct, muscle memory. And then he went upstairs. He wasn't sure what happened next, but he was standing in the master bedroom, the one where his parents had once slept. Lakshmanrao and Shanta were already dead. Cox said that he panicked. He left the scene, walked to his parents' home on Prospect Street, and then fell asleep. When he woke up, there was blood on his clothing. He told the group his mother had thrown the clothes away. Later, he said he returned to the Chervu's home, cleaned anything he thought he'd touched, and said he tossed the murder weapon into the Long Island Sound. One of the members of that AA group was his girlfriend at the time, a woman referred to only as Miss S. She recalled how Cox had broken down in tears as he recounted what he thought he'd done. She remembered, "I said no way. I know you're loving and kind, it's not possible." Another member, Mr. S., remembered it differently. He didn't brush it off, he later said. He told me he thought he had done something really bad. He said after a period of drinking, he had gone into these people's house where he lived and killed the people with a knife while they slept. The confession had happened 4 years before the arrest. Because it had been made in an AA meeting, under a veil of confidentiality, nobody went to police. Not then. Even as the murders remained unsolved, even as the headlines faded, even as the Chervu family pleaded for answers. For 4 years, those words sat like a stone at the bottom of a river, until somebody finally came forward. And when they did, detectives reopened the case file and began to dig. Because this wasn't a tip, it was a roadmap, and Paul Cox had already drawn the route. Once someone from the AA group finally came forward with Paul Cox's confession, detectives reopened the file that had sat cold for over 4 years. They went back to the crash, and sure enough it checked out. The abandoned 1979 Chevrolet sedan had in fact been discovered smashed into a guardrail on 5th Avenue in New Rochelle, just like Cox had said. It was Detective Sergeant Robert Smith who had found it. Now that part of the story was confirmed. Detectives needed to know what else was true. Paul Cox was arrested and brought in. His fingerprints were taken and run through the system. They came back as a match to unidentified fingerprints from the Chervu crime scene. Paul Cox was charged with 4 counts of second-degree murder and ordered to be held on $250,000 bail. As part of the agreement, he would wear an electronic ankle monitor and remain confined to his parents' home in Larchmont. It wasn't what prosecutors had wanted. They had asked for a $2 million bail. They told the judge that Cox had a history of psychiatric treatment and that he had once told a nurse he might try to flee. Cox's defence attorney, Andre Rubin, pushed back. He said that if Paul Cox had really intended to run, he'd had 4 years to do it. The judge agreed. Bail was lowered, and Paul Cox went home. The Chervu family was furious. Saraswati, Lakshmanrao's sister, was devastated and commented, "It is very unfair. We're very frightened by this. How can they let him go?" Her sister, Lakshmi, echoed the same disbelief. They had waited years for justice, and now the man accused of murdering their loved ones was walking free, living in comfort just blocks from the crime scene. To them, it felt like the system was minimising their pain, trivialising loss. The legal teams began preparing for trial, and it didn't take long before it became clear what the strategy the defence planned to pursue. Insanity. Rubin made the first hint in a press statement when he said, "Assuming that he did commit these acts, it's clear they weren't committed by somebody in his right mind." Jury selection began in May of 1994. Rubin addressed the prospective jurors with a haunting observation. "It's every person's nightmare to be stabbed while you sleep." He also asked how they felt about a psychiatric defence. The prosecutors, led by George Boland, were blunt. They wouldn't have an eyewitness. They didn't need one. They were building a case on forensics, confessions and circumstantial evidence. Boland was firm when he said, "You will not hear from any one witness who could be an eyewitness to the actual crime." But outside the courtroom, a more complex issue began to unfold. The case raised legal and ethical questions about confidentiality and whether self-help programs like Alcoholics Anonymous should be shielded in the same way as therapy with a licensed professional. Most states only protect conversations that take place under the care of a licensed psychotherapist or physician. AA, by contrast, was peer-led. So when people finally broke their silence, was it a betrayal or was it justice? And in that grey area, the future of the case would hang in the balance. On the morning of the 2nd of June, 1994, Paul Cox was led into the courtroom. He wore a suit and his hair was neatly combed. He took a seat beside his defence team while his parents, stoic and pale, sat behind him in the gallery. Across the aisle sat the Chervu family, and while they said nothing, their grief was unmistakable. They had waited years for this day. They didn't believe that Paul Cox was insane. Ranganatha, Shanta's brother-in-law, spoke bluntly when he said, "Insanity is just the state of the art of getting out." For the Chervus, the idea that this man, who had once lived in the very same house as them, could now claim madness felt like a second betrayal. They showed up to court every day. They had to. They said it felt like a responsibility. Opening statements then began. Defence attorney Andrew Rubin addressed the jury and said, "Nothing speaks of a person who was in his right mind when these crimes were committed." Then came the evidence. The testimony began with officers who recalled finding the crime scene, a home bathed in blood. Arati Chervu, the couple's daughter, took the stand. She spoke about the knife block she had purchased for her parents, a set of 5. She had last seen all 5 knives there on December 27th. After the murders, one was missing. That missing knife, the prosecution would argue, became the weapon that ended the 2 lives. Then came Miss S., Paul Cox's ex-girlfriend. She testified that Cox had confessed to her, believing that he had killed the Chervus in a blackout. From the defence table, Cox broke down in tears as she spoke. Miss S. also revealed that in moments of drunken despair, Cox would carve crosses into his arms. One by one, 4 more AA members took to the stand. Each of them had heard Paul Cox confess to the murders. To them, the confessions had sounded dreamlike, surreal, like something pulled from a nightmare. But then came a much clearer account. Mr. S., a former roommate, told the court that Cox had confessed to him directly, not during a meeting but in private. He remembered every word. He said, "The woman woke up and he stabbed her many times. He told me the man woke up and was pleading with him. He stabbed him many times. And before he left, he slit their throats to make sure they were dead." It was graphic, personal, and specific, and to the prosecution it was more than a foggy recollection. It was a story told with detail. Mr. R also said that, contrary to what Cox had told the AA group about his mother disposing of the bloody clothes, he had actually burned them himself. Under cross-examination, Rubin tried to discredit the witness. Mr. R admitted to having taken LSD and other drugs, and said he had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals 10 or 11 times. He was even an escapee from a New Haven institution when he met Cox. But the story never changed. Another former roommate, Miss H, echoed this account. She said Cox would wake up screaming from nightmares in which he relived the murders. She testified, "It seemed like a little boy was talking. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't his usual voice." It was Miss H who eventually went to police. Without her, the case may never have been reopened. Then the trial turned to the forensic evidence, and it was damning. Cox's palm print and 2 fingerprints were found around the back door to the Chervu's home. A bloody handprint on a pillowcase bore a fingerprint that matched Cox's left index finger. Thomas Wall, a forensic supervisor, testified about blood found on a Venetian blind cord in the bedroom. It didn't belong to either victim. It may have been Cox's blood, he told the court. The physical evidence tied the nightmare to reality. The confessions, whether vague or not, were no longer floating in the dark. Now they were grounded in blood, fingerprints, and science. And with that, the prosecution rested. Next, it was the defence's turn. And their strategy would be simple. Paul Cox wasn't in his right mind. He was broken, damaged, and mad. Or at least, they would try to convince the jury of that. The defence opened their case with a familiar figure. Mary Vandernoot Cox, Paul's mother. She sat before the jury, a woman in her 60s, composed but trembling. She was here to paint a portrait not of a killer, but of a broken boy. She told them that Paul was her 5th child, that from the beginning there were problems. He couldn't stay dry throughout the night. He struggled in school. "I guess we were disappointed," she admitted. She talked about her son's suicide attempt in high school and how he never graduated. How he drifted through college attempts, through jobs, through the Air Force. And she spoke about that night and the crash. The police had told her his car had been found wrecked and abandoned. She said she went to check his bedroom and it was empty. Mary's testimony was heartbreaking, and some would later say persuasive. She cried occasionally, but she always regained control. The defence then turned to psychiatry. Dr. David Weber, a psychiatrist, took to the stand and said, "He really snapped. He went through these actions as if he was going back in time to eliminate the people he blamed for all of his problems when he was 7 years old." Weber believed that Cox had been suffering from dysgraphia, a learning disability that went undiagnosed until adulthood. He said the frustration from his academic failures festered into violent fantasies of killing himself, of killing his parents. And that night, drunk on beer and kamikaze cocktails, something inside him broke. He testified, "It stands to reason that he couldn't have been in possession of his reason at the time." But the prosecution pushed back. They suggested that Cox had simply lied to the psychiatrist. They pointed to his vivid dreams of his parents dead in bed. They weren't hallucinations, they were plans. 2 more defense experts testified. Daniel Martel, a forensic psychologist, said that Cox scored just 1 point away from schizophrenia. He said, "He's well-groomed, presentable, but underneath he's shattered." But under cross-examination, both Martel and Weber admitted that Cox showed very few classic signs of psychosis. That's when the prosecution called Dr. Alan Tuckman, chief forensic psychiatrist for Rockland County. And his conclusion was clear. He said, "He has personality disorders. He has a problem with alcohol, but there's no evidence of a severe mental illness." Dr. Tuckman pointed out that after the murders, Cox appeared completely normal. To his family, his friends, himself. He said, "I just can't identify any psychotic disorder that renders a person psychotic and then disappears a few hours later." The case was drawing to a close. During closing arguments, defense attorney Andrew Rubin made a final plea and said, "There's an unpopular notion of the insanity defense. People see it as a cop-out. But the truth," he said, "was more complicated." He asked them to consider mental illness, not just blood and fingerprints. The prosecution, led by George Boland, delivered a scathing rebuttal. Say to Paul Cox, "Your manipulative ways have come to an end." The jury then retired to deliberate. But after 9 hours, they sent a note to the judge. They were stuck. One juror refused to move. The other said this juror didn't seem to understand the instructions. Worse, she couldn't support her opinion with evidence. They wrote, "This juror is basing their verdict on opinion and cannot support it with concrete evidence." The judge urged them to continue, and they did for 3 more days, but the lone juror refused to budge. The rest were furious. They called her refusal an insult to their intelligence. They stayed overnight at the court's request, and still nothing changed. 3 more days and still no verdict. Finally, the judge declared a mistrial. A new trial was scheduled for November. Outside court, a reporter asked one of the jurors a simple question. "Do you think Paul Cox was insane?" Her answer was swift. "No, it's as simple as that." They had wanted a conviction, but one woman wasn't convinced. And Paul Cox, for the moment, walked free. In November of 1994, Paul Cox walked back into court. A new trial, a new jury, but the same 2 lives lost. This time he testified in his own defence. His voice trembled as he recounted a loveless childhood inside the very home where Lakshmanrao and Shanta were brutally murdered. He said he never felt like a true part of his family, that the house itself was soaked in bad memories. He told the jury about a birthday party where his family left him alone to watch television, about stealing food at school because his mother wouldn't pack him snacks. And the worst humiliation, he said, was the bedwetting. His mother, he claimed, hung a calendar in the kitchen. Every morning she'd mark it, a scarlet X for every accident. He said the shame of it all drove him to alcohol, that by the time he was in his 20s he needed a wake-up beer just to stop the shaking. Then came the dreams. He testified, "There would be dreams where I would see myself swinging the knife, an up and down motion, slashing side to side. I never saw the knife going into anything. It was just the motion of the knife. I still can't believe that I did it, but I look at the evidence and realise I must have. To say I'm sorry would be a total understatement." The jury retired to deliberate. 4 days passed. Just like the first trial, the jury was divided. But this time, they returned with a verdict. Paul Cox was found guilty, but not of murder. Instead, he was convicted of first-degree manslaughter. They believed that he had killed the Chervus. He had admitted as much, but they also believed he had done so while suffering from what the law calls an extreme emotional disturbance. In the gallery, the Chervu family sat stunned. Their daughter, Arati, said, "He acted with no conscience. He has acted with no remorse whatsoever throughout this trial." In March the next year, Paul Cox stood for sentencing. He addressed the family of the people he killed and said, "For the rest of my life, I'm going to regret what happened that night. I'm not lying. I'm sorry. That's all I can say." The judge then handed down the maximum sentence, which was up to 50 years in prison. In the aftermath, Paul Cox appealed his sentence several times. By 2001, he had exhausted all of his appeals in the state court. But now his attorney, Joshua Siegel, had a different argument. He said the Alcoholics Anonymous confessions should never have been allowed in court, that AA at its core was religious in nature, and that the same confidentiality given to a priest should apply to AA members. And a federal judge agreed. U.S. District Judge Charles Brent overturned Cox's conviction in August of 2001, ruling that the AA conversations were privilege and inadmissible in court. But Paul Cox wasn't going anywhere. The following July, a federal appeals court reversed the ruling and reinstated the conviction. They wrote, "Cox spoke with other AA members primarily to unburden himself, to seek empathy and emotional support, and perhaps in some instances to seek practical guidance. His communications at issue here would therefore not be privileged." Paul Cox remains in prison. He has served decades now, behind bars for a crime committed in a house he once called a home. Well, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a big ol' thank you to my newest supporters up on Patreon, Tara, Jade, Jennifer, and the Marx Brothers. Morbidology is a one-woman podcast, so the support up on there seriously goes such a long way. It helps to defray the costs of hosting, subscriptions, and freedom of information requests, and I am eternally grateful. Morbidology is now up on YouTube, so if you could head on over there and hit that subscribe button, I would be eternally grateful. The episodes there are done in a documentary style, with photographs and videos associated with each episode. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.